Hey, I'm Jim Dewey, and this is Combating the Narrative. Today we're going to be talking about a YouTuber by the name of Johnny Harris. So, Johnny Harris, for those of you who don't know, actually has a rather large following on YouTube. At the time of this recording, 2.61 million subscribers. The video we're going to be talking about today on the Mexican-American War has 2.5 million views. He's reached that many people with his lies. The comment sections on his videos are chock full of people mindlessly agreeing with him. This man typically offers no sources, no citations, and is reliant mostly on what he feels to be his own good looks to get by. This is apparent in the way he edits his videos and how his face is a primary feature on every single one of his videos about history. So when a man with this kind of reach and this kind of charisma and the willingness to use clickbaity titles like How the United States Stole Mexico, it can't be allowed to go unchallenged, and that's the point of today's video. Without further delay, let's hop right into it. Try not to be super distracted by his totally lopsided head like I was the whole time.
Back when the British Empire was colonizing all of this land, they drew a line. The line went right along this little mountain range, and it was meant as a boundary. Back in London, they were saying that no English settler was allowed to settle west of this line. The British Empire did this because they were worried that if settlers started to expand into the west, they would bring the British Empire into a war with native populations. They also didn't want to unnecessarily piss off France, who also had land in the west.
So what he's referring to here, for those of you who don't know, is the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So this was a proclamation issued by King George III immediately following the French and Indian War, which, yes, did prohibit English settlement west of the Appalachians. I'm really not sure where he's getting this idea that that line was drawn to avoid getting into another conflict with France. All the territory up to the Mississippi River had been ceded to England in the treaty that ended the war. Furthermore, throughout English and British history, they seem to have zero issue instigating fights with the French. At any rate, what was the bigger issue is that the British Crown really could not protect English settlers against the savage Indians whose known rule of warfare did not distinguish between sexes or ages, to paraphrase the U.S. Declaration of Independence. In the eyes of the Crown, this was for the good of the colonists. At any rate, this very proclamation was a source of tension between the colonies and the Crown that eventually would boil over into a revolution.
So they told their settlers to settle, but not past this line. And then the settlers completely ignored it.
See, he's very ambiguous with the timeline he's referring to when he said, and the colonists ignored it. And that's very important because, yes, after the Americans won independence, they were no longer obliged to obey the edicts of a foreign government. If he's talking about while the British were still in charge here in the colonies, I'm certain some colonists did disregard that proclamation, but to what degree, I don't know. My gut feeling is that it was largely heeded. If the American colonists were in the habit of, on a very large scale, just openly and flagrantly disobeying the British Crown, number one, they wouldn't have been upset about the edict because who follows it anyway? And number two, there would have been a much larger response from the Crown, which simply didn't happen. Now, perhaps I'm wrong, but he's the one making the claim here, and I'd like to see some evidence to substantiate it. And again, this wasn't out of some altruistic desire of the British monarchy to protect the Indians. It was to protect their own colonists, because if they were to go west of the Appalachians, they would effectively be out of the protection of the Crown, and the Crown really didn't want to get into yet another Indian war. They had neither the manpower nor the resources to sustain such a conflict. So ultimately, what do you care if they did violate that edict? I mean, the worst that could happen is they get killed by Indians. Stupid games, stupid prizes. Oh, and that graphic up on your screen that you've been looking at, note that it's got the 1763 King's Proclamation, like Johnny Boy here mentions, but it's also got two other lines, the Treaty of Hard Labor and the Fort Stanwix boundary line. These boundary lines only a few years later, superseded and replaced the 1763 King's Proclamation long before the American Revolution was complete. So to claim that they just ignored the Appalachian boundary line is disingenuous at best and an outright lie at worst.
These settlers would eventually declare independence from Britain and start their own country. And from there, the floodgates were open for westward expansion.
No, not correct. The floodgates were thrown open when white people came here. I mean, westward expansion was the trend and the foregone conclusion. Moreover, the lands to which the United States settlers were traveling to had by and large already been explored and at some point settled by other white people, whether it be Frenchmen or Spaniards or what have you. Westward expansion and settlement wasn't something unique to the United States or something that would not have happened had it not been for the United States.
Frontier people had remade a continent. Virtually all productive land had been put to the plow. A free and independent way of life prevailed.
Johnny Boy here unintentionally brings up another point. Notice that in that documentary, they're mentioning how for the first time all this land is getting put to the plow. Consider that for a moment. The natives who lived in this territory were not the same as the ones in South America with vast sprawling empires and cities and civilization and agriculture. No, these were nomadic tribal people who, by the standards of the day, were backward and barbaric. It's pretty hard to steal land that's barely being occupied and isn't being properly used.
This westward blitz was made possible through the mass slaughter of people who were living on this land, which...
Okay, citation needed there, guy. Show me the proof of the one-sided mass slaughter, because you want to know what I have plenty of evidence for? Two-sided wars in which both sides at different points had committed acts of perfidy and savagery. This was, however, mostly on the side of the Indian, who had instigated a lot of the conflict. Moreover, I can point to a lot of treaties in which the United States purchased land from the Indian tribes or gained the land through treaty, not through slaughter and extermination. Maybe displacement. But that's really the most you can justifiably make it out to be.
This little time-lapse ignores. How that all went down will be the subject of another video. But right now, I want to talk about what happened when the US got here. It's the mid-1800s and the US has 27 states and a bunch of territories in the West. But the country doesn't stretch from sea to shining sea quite yet. At this point, they start to bump into the recently independent country of Mexico.
Well, initially Spain and then, yes, Mexico. But note that we didn't have a conflict with Spain for like another 75 years almost. And even then, wasn't really over territory on the continent. And yeah, I'm sure you're going to bring up the fact that there were some Americans involved in some minor conflicts against Spain as part of the Mexican Revolution, but not in any real large number and not sanctioned by the United States. And what do you mean specifically by bumped into? Are there like border disputes I'm unaware of that you know about? Because it seems to me that mostly unoccupied lands on both sides just happen to abut each other.
The northern part of Mexico was called Texas, or Texas, and it was populated mainly with native groups, who had nothing to do with the US or Mexico. They had just been living there for centuries.
Well, living there is kind of a diplomatic way of putting exactly what was going on. The northern territories of Mexico have always been comparatively lawless, and that's in juxtaposition to the rest of Mexico and South America, which is, in and of itself, very corrupt and lawless. The Mexicans were constantly coming into conflict with Indians in the region, the same as the United States during their expansion, and really didn't have the ability to deal with it. And that's not even assigning a value judgment there. I mean, such is the way of humanity. I forget where I heard it, but one time somebody told me that if all of human history had a soundtrack, it would just be the beating of a war drum.
So Mexico's looking at this fairly new, sparsely populated part of their country and thinking, what do we do with all this land? They wanted to incentivize people to go and settle in this land. So
Yeah, they're wondering what to do with the territory. I mean, a good chunk of the population is just Indians who seem to want to wage war upon them, and another good chunk of the population are lawless, corrupt bandits. Do you want to know why they specifically wanted to incentivize Americans to come there? Americans had a lot of experience dealing with Indian tribes, and they wanted the Americans to bring the law and order that they had established in American territories to the north of Mexico.
it would potentially be more economically productive for the country of Mexico. So they made a plan. They started to rent huge swaths of land to American settlers.
It was only about economics insofar as bringing law and order to a lawless region facilitates economic growth. And where are you getting this idea that the land was rented to the settlers? No, under the Mexican general colonization law, anyone of any race, ethnicity, or nationality could claim land in Mexico with a few exceptions. Most notably, the colonists had to convert to Catholicism. It's almost as though the Mexican government recognized the value of some cultural homogeneity in a society. And recognizing that their country was shifting demographically and that the new settlers may not have a primary allegiance to Mexico but to their country of origin, this law was rescinded in 1830. But again, to reiterate, this land was not rented, it was freely given by Mexican law because they needed to establish law and order in the northern territories of Mexico.
So they would come in and settle the land. And in return, these American settlers would recruit more settlers to come in and settle the land, again, all with the hope that it would benefit Mexico's economy eventually.
Again, the primary concern here isn't this vague notion of the economy. It's not as though the Mexican government is sitting here and thinking the GDP numbers don't look so good. They're looking to establish law and order in a lawless and savage territory, and they wanted to use Americans to do it.
It did exactly the opposite. American settlers fled into Texas onto the...
Whoa, buddy. Fled? Fled from what, precisely? They were not only invited in, they were given free land in exchange for living there and turning the savage wilderness into a civilized nation.
Newly rented land, just as the Mexican government hoped for. But with them, they brought slaves, which was totally illegal in Mexico at the time.
Again, not rented. They were invited in and given free land. Stop saying that. Stop lying. Okay, it was also illegal to not be Catholic in Mexico at the time, so laws don't necessarily equate to morality. But yes, they did bring slaves in. Slavery was legal in the United States. It's almost as though immigrants will often hold the laws of their new host nation in contempt and carry over their old practices and customs from wherever it is they came from. Interesting how that works. I wonder if there's any parallels that could be drawn to, like, politics today. I mean, who knows? Maybe, like, immigration is bad for the host nation. Huh. Worth some thought, I think.
They also brought with them an attitude of independence and frontier fever.
Is an attitude of independence and frontier fever a bad thing? Again, it's interesting. It's almost like immigrants don't adopt the cultures and customs of their host nations. It's just bizarre. Surely the same thing can't be true today. This must be something unique to us perfidious white people.
American obsession with moving west to settle new land.
The westward movement was like a great tidal wave. The odd corners were rapidly engulfed.
Mexico soon realized that this plan completely backfired, and that the Americans that had rented land from them were now not interested in having Mexico as their government.
What? No way. Immigrants don't want to be governed by their host nation? They want to have self-governance by people who look and talk and act like them? I don't believe it. Also, stop lying. They were given the land, they owned it, they did not rent it. This was not a lease from the Mexican government.
So, Mexico sends in the military to remind the settlers that they're still in Mexico.
Wow, man. How oppressive and discriminatory of the Mexican government. They should have, just accepted the demographic shift and, realized that diversity is their strength and they shouldn't have that racist, oppressive attitude.
And that they're technically renting this land from Mexico.
No, they were not. Under Mexican law, it was given to them by charter. They were allowed to have a certain amount of it so long as it wasn't within a certain distance from a foreign border or a waterway. Stop telling this ridiculous lie. Stop. It was their land given to them in Mexico. They owned it. They didn't steal it. They didn't rent it. They owned it.
Well, this eventually escalated, and they started to fight all-out battles, and the American settlers lost.
Well, that's a gross oversimplification of events. Mexico was not like a stable nation at this point in time. The Texas Revolution was part of a series of uprisings in Mexico that took place around the same time. These uprisings were largely suppressed by Santa Anna, who himself led an uprising, and the guy was deposed like 7 times. And yeah, tensions rose. The Mexicans tried to tighten their grip, and naturally the Texans resisted it. And then the Mexicans tried to take the cannon back from the Texans, which they had given to the Texans to protect themselves from Indian raids. Now, the Texans realized, as most free people do, that generally speaking, when a government wants to take your weapons, they generally intend to do something for which you would shoot at them. And where do you get off implying that the Texans, lost a bunch of battles? Yeah, they lost the Battle of the Alamo, but you're missing a lot of context there. The Alamo was never meant to be like a pitched, drawn-out battle in which the Texans had any hope of winning. You have to understand that it was like 185 men holding out for 13 days waiting on reinforcements that never came. They were eventually overrun by a force of 5,000. And it took those 5,000 battle-hardened, well-equipped, regular troops 13 days. 13 whole days to overrun the position of 185 whites and Tejanos with hunting rifles. And guess what? Even if they had lost every single battle, they still won the war. They still accomplished their political objectives. So
The big battle here was called the Battle of the Alamo. This guy, Davy Crockett, who was like the symbol of westward expansion, died in this battle. And this loss spurred even more settlers to come to Texas and join the next fight against Mexico.
Part of what spurred them to come and join the fight was the fact that Santa Anna had just committed such an egregious war crime in which he had slaughtered to a man every person who had dared to oppose his will at the Alamo. Those brave men who valiantly fought, outnumbered 500 to 1, were just executed by a tyrant. And had the Americans done such a thing to the Mexicans, we would never hear the end of it.
Which the American settlers won. And with that, they declared a new nation, independent of Mexico, the Republic of Texas. And now the map looks like this: a newly declared country of American settlers in between Mexico and the United States.
Well, former Americans who settled in the province, along with Tejanos who also had a bone to pick with the Mexican government. So, because this video is already so long, I'm going to break it down into 3 parts. I'm sure you guys will appreciate that. So, this is goodbye for now. As always, feel free to leave comments, questions, concerns, death threats, whatever you got, I'll take it.